Hi guys, welcome back to Chess the Matthew. So on this video, we will tackle about an opening which is the so-called King's Gambit Accepted in a Kieseritsky Variation. So before we look at the set opening, let's solve first this puzzle. So again, it is white to move because the last move of black is king to h4. So we shall see on this position that the king is actually in an odd situation in which the black king is actually on the enemy's camp, for example, on the king side of white. So here on this position, it is actually mate in 2. To solve the puzzle, we must give a force check against the white king so that we can come up with the 2 limited moves. So here, the possible check against the black king is the pawn, for example, and with the queen, for example, on g3 square. But if the pawn will be moved, there is a simple king move to h3, and it is, although still there is a checkmate, for example, after king h3. It is another possible line, but again, we can go with another idea, which is to mate the black king with a pawn. And it all starts with the move of queen h3 check. So there is no cover, there is no escape against the check because there is a rook on the g7. So the only defense against the check is a capture. So after g takes h3, but there is g3 checkmate. So the black king has no cover against the check. He cannot escape, rather, or he cannot even capture these checking pieces because it was actually supported with the rook on g7. So in just 2 moves, for example, after this position, the black king got mated with a pawn. So here we go now on the King's Gambit Accepted with the Kieseritsky Variation. So the side opening start with the moves of e4, and after e5, the white here gambited a pawn with f4. So after e takes f4, this is now the so-called King's Gambit Accepted. So after knight f3, g5, defending the pawn on the f4. For example, anticipating the fact that after d4, there is an attack on the f4. But here, the white will simply play the h4, again trying to ruin the pawn structure of the black. For example, if he captured this pawn on h4, then again, there is just a simple rook takes, for example, or knight takes, for example, in this position. But again, the black here will play the move g4, attacking the knight with the pawn. And after, for example, knight to e5 and h5. So this is now the so-called Kieseritsky Variation. So the idea of h5 is to defend his g4 pawn with the attack of the queen and knight. But here on this position, the white simply plays bishop to c4, developing a piece while threatening to capture the f7. Because from the fact that the white here gambited a pawn, then for the sake of compensation, the white should here go for an activity. For example, developing a piece. And soon, the white here can actually castle on the king side. So for the cost of the pawn, the white here has a rapid development on the board. So for example, after bishop to c4, rook h7, defending his f7 pawn with 2 defender versus the 2 attackers. But here, the white simply captured that pawn because after bishop takes f7, there's a check. And after, for example, rook takes and knight takes and king takes f7. But here, after king takes f7, again, the white here should cope up with the development or even a control in the center, for example, after d4. And again, with a threat. But here, the black simply plays d6, trying to open up some lines for his bishop. Again, this position, defending his g4. And again, anticipating the pawn push on e5. But after d6, again, there is simple bishop takes f4, trying to open now the f file, for example, and again, developing a piece on this position. And later on, the white king here can castle on the king side and try to develop his bishop to pressure now the f-file. So after knight to d7, trying to cope up with development, but still there is bishop to g5, attacking the queen. And after, for example, bishop e7, here we go now the king side castling with the check. So again, the black here should defend the check, whether he will capture the checking pieces, but it is not possible. For example, we cannot capture the rook f1. And again, to cover the check with 3 minor pieces, or even to escape against the check with king to g6. So after king to g6, there is no check at all. So here, the white plays d5, trying to open up some lines, for example, on this diagonal from h7 to b1, so that the white queen here can give a check. And again, maintaining the activity, for example, against the black, because as we look to the position, some of the pieces of the black here is actually on a passive position. So after bishop takes to g5, instead of recapturing the bishop, there is queen d3 check first, so that, for example, after king h6, here comes now the rook f7, threatening to mate in 1, for example, after a move with the queen to h7 or even the rook, for example, on this position. So after knight g to f6, covering any possible mating threat, for example, on the h7, but there is simple h takes to g5 check. So again, the only defense against the check is to capture the checking pieces. But still, there is rook g7 check. And if the black king here will retreat, then there is a checkmate. So, for example, if the king will move here, then there is again a checkmate in 1. So, the black king here was again forced to play king to h4, allowing the nice checkmate net with the pawn. For example, after sacrificing a queen, for example, after takes and g3 checkmate. So, going back, for example, one more time with the King's Gambit Accepted. For example, after here, the black accept the gambit of white. Here comes now the knight f3, g5, h4, and after g4 trying to attack the knight, but there is simple knight to e5, again with a threat to capture na the g4, whether the queen or the knight, for example. But here in this position, the black plays h5 to defend now the g4 pawn. Going back, for example, on this move 5 after knight e5 of white, the black here can again play knight to f6 instead of h5. Because after knight f6, it stopped the idea of any sacrifice of a piece on the f7. Because after bishop c4, say, again, the white is actually be consistent with this idea by attacking the f7, but there is simple d5. And if this capture will be on the white's mind, then the white will lose his bishop pair. So after it takes to d5, there is simple bishop to d6. And again, after, for example, d4, knight h5, defending now his pawn on f4. So for example, after king side castling of white, then the black here can simply castle on the king side also. With an idea, for example, if the white here will grab the pawn on f4, then there is queen to h4, takes the pawn. And again, equalize the material on the board, counting these pawns on d4 and d5 as just a one pawn because it is actually a doubled pawns. So let's say, for example, going back after knight e5, although there is no bad thing after h5, for example, because after bishop to c4, rook h7 still okay for black because after bishop takes, rook takes, knight takes, and king takes f7, the black here has still slight initiative because it is better to have two minor pieces rather than a rook, for example, in the middle game. So after d4, d6 still okay, for example, after bishop takes f4, again, knight e7 and bishop g5 and bishop e7. Although there is a check after king side castling of white, but king g6 still okay, for example, after e5, and from the fact that after bishop takes g5 and queen to d3 check, the black here should not play in the text move of playing king h6, but rather to play a safe move with king g7. Because although there is h takes to g5, but there is simple knight takes to e5. And let's say, for example, after queen to e3, hoping that the black will capture the pawn and give a check to this diagonal against the black's king, but there's simple d5. Again, pressurizing now the deeper pawn to capture, for example, whether he will capture the e pawn or the c pawn, for example. But after d takes c5, there is queen to e5, pressurizing now the pawn with two attackers and only one defender. So after a developing move of knight c3, queen takes c5, queen takes c5, it is actually forced because the queen was actually pinned down with the queen on c5. But after knight takes to c5, again, there is just an equality on the board. So to equal the position, for example, after queen to d3, the black here should play king to g7 rather than a losing move after king h6 because there is rook f7, and again, with a threat to mate in h7 square. So with a threat of checkmate on this square in h7, so the content move plays knight g to f6 to defend h7. Although the black here can try another move, for example, without sacrificing his knight by playing knight f8, but there is simple h takes to g5 with a check. And even though there is a capture, for example, if the black king here will capture this pawn, then there is a double attack with a check, for example, and threatening to capture now the knight on g8, for example, after king takes to h5. So let's say, for example, queen takes g5, but still the knight on f8 is undefended, so why not to capture? And after king g7 and rook f1, the white here has an extra minor piece on the b1 square. So rook f7 and, for example, knight g to f6, again, this is actually a losing position. For example, after h takes to g5 check, king takes, rook g7 check, queen h4, and again with a sacrifice, move up, queen h3 check, and g takes h3 and g3 checkmate with a pawn. So again, after on this move 5 of white, although the black here plays h5 and allows a capture on f7, but the black here can try after knight to e5 with knight f6 to claim an easy equality on the opening. For example, after bishop c4, stopping any sacrifice on f7, because after bishop d6 and d4 and knight h5, in which the black here is actually totally fine after kingside castling. And another thing, for example, after this moment, for example, after queen to d3 check, the black here should not play king h6 because it allows here for the white to play rook f7 and again with an easy win. Rather than play the move king g7 to stop any rook f7, and again after some couple of moves, the black here can actually force a draw after having a forced queen trade on the board. So that's all. I hope you enjoyed this video and please don't forget to subscribe.